Good evening. You are listening to Lost Signal Radio, and we are interrupting our regular programming to bring you what our editorial team is calling, and I want to be careful with this language, a developing atmospheric anomaly of unknown origin and potentially significant scale. I'm Alex Mercer. Joining me tonight is Sierra Lane. Sierra, thank you for coming in on short notice.
Thank you, Alex. I'll say right now that when the call came in, I didn't hesitate. Whatever is happening, people deserve continuous, steady coverage. And that's what we intend to provide tonight and for however long the situation continues to develop.
What we know at this moment is this. Atmospheric monitoring stations on 4 continents have independently reported measurable increases in ambient oxygen concentration. The baseline, as most of our listeners will know from basic science education, sits at approximately 20.9%. As of the most recent confirmed readings, stations in Adelaide, Australia, Reykjavik, Iceland, Nairobi, Kenya, and Boulder, Colorado, are all reporting figures between 23 and 24%. That is a statistically significant deviation. The World Meteorological Organization has issued a preliminary advisory, and we are told a full statement is expected within the hour.
I want to contextualize that number for people who may be hearing this on their commute home or in their kitchens or wherever you are right now. 23% doesn't sound like a lot. It's only a few percentage points above normal. But what matters in atmospheric science, and Alex, please correct me if I'm getting this wrong, is that even small shifts in oxygen concentration have enormous downstream consequences. We've already received messages from listeners who are saying they feel unusually alert, a little lightheaded, almost like a mild caffeine rush. If you are feeling that, you are not imagining it. And we will address health guidance as we receive it from official sources.
That's correct, Sierra, and I appreciate you framing it that way. The human body is extraordinarily sensitive to oxygen partial pressure. At 23%, most healthy adults would notice heightened alertness, possibly mild euphoria, a slight reduction in the effort required to breathe. These are not immediately dangerous symptoms. What concerns atmospheric scientists, and I've been in contact with 2 of them in the last 40 minutes, is the rate of change. These measurements are not static. They are trending upward. The Boulder station is now reporting 24.3%, and the reading from Adelaide has climbed to 25.1. If this trend continues at anything approaching its current pace, we are looking at a fundamentally different set of concerns within a matter of days.
And I think that's the word I want to stay with for a moment, which is uncertainty. We are in the very early hours of this, and I want to be honest with our listeners. We do not know the cause. We do not know how far this will go. We do not know if it will reverse. And I think in situations like this, the most important thing we can do, more important than any single piece of data, is to be honest about the boundaries of what we know and don't know. What we do know is that people are already reacting. We are getting reports of hardware stores in Sydney, Australia, selling out of fire extinguishers. There are traffic jams reported on the M4 motorway outside London. People are feeling something in the air, literally, and they are moving.
We have just received a statement from the Australian Bureau of Meteorology, and I will read this verbatim. Quote, "The Bureau of Meteorology confirms it is monitoring an anomalous and ongoing increase in atmospheric oxygen concentration across multiple stations nationwide. At this time, the cause of this increase is unknown. Citizens are advised to avoid open flames and to exercise caution with electrical equipment. A further statement will be issued within 3 hours." End quote. That is the Australian Bureau of Meteorology. It is notable that they have already issued a precautionary warning about open flames. That, to my reading, suggests their internal modeling is ahead of what they are prepared to say publicly.
And when a government scientific body tells you to avoid open flames, that is a message people need to hear immediately and clearly. If you are listening right now, please do not light candles tonight. Do not use gas stovetops if you can avoid it. Do not smoke. These are simple precautions, and they may feel excessive right now, but they are not. Higher oxygen concentrations dramatically lower the ignition threshold of ordinary materials. Things that normally require a sustained flame to catch fire can ignite with a spark. We are not in that range yet, but the trajectory being described by Alex, the upward trend, is something we have to take seriously.
It's been approximately 4 hours now since the first confirmed anomalous readings were logged. I want to walk through the geography of this, because one of the things that is striking early-stage atmospheric scientists is the apparent uniformity of the increase across vastly different geographic regions. This is not a local event. Adelaide and Reykjavik are on opposite sides of the planet. Nairobi and Boulder have completely different atmospheric basins. For all four to be trending upward simultaneously and at comparable rates suggests either a global atmospheric mechanism of some kind or a number of simultaneous localized sources so widely distributed as to function like a global one. Neither explanation is currently satisfying scientists.
We are getting our first confirmed listener messages now, and I want to read a few of these. This one is from a listener in Bangalore, India, who asked that we use only his first name, Rajan. He writes, "My elderly mother is on supplemental oxygen therapy. My home nurse called me in a panic tonight saying the concentrations in the tank might now be unsafe given what's happening in the air. I don't know what to do. Please help." Rajan, we hear you. We are seeking guidance on this specific issue right now. What I can tell our listeners in medical situations is that you should contact your home health provider or physician immediately. This is a legitimate medical concern.
That is an extremely important point, and I'm glad you raised it. Medical oxygen therapy is calibrated to deliver specific concentrations against a known baseline atmospheric composition. If that baseline has shifted, the net oxygen exposure for a supplemental oxygen patient may have increased without any change in their equipment settings. We have reached out to the World Health Organization for guidance, and we expect a response within the hour. To Rajan and to every listener in a similar situation, contact your care team now. Do not wait.
We're about 5.5 hours into coverage now. There has been, and I have to report this carefully, a fire reported at a chemical storage facility outside of Sao Paulo, Brazil. Brazilian authorities are saying it began in what was described as a locked and inactive section of the facility. They have not confirmed a cause. The fire grew faster than responders expected. That is the language they used, faster than expected. The facility has been evacuated and surrounding neighborhoods are sheltering in place. We do not yet have casualty figures, but at this stage that matters less than the pattern. A fire starting spontaneously in an inactive space. Growing faster than expected. Those are the two data points that, when I read them, made something in my chest tighten.
And they are significant data points precisely because they are consistent with what we would expect in a higher oxygen environment. Combustion is fundamentally a chemical reaction between fuel and an oxidizer. When you increase the concentration of the oxidizer, the reaction becomes more vigorous. The Sao Paulo facility incident, if it is what it appears to be, may be our first real-world confirmation that we are past the threshold of merely statistical concern and into the territory of measurable environmental consequence. The World Meteorological Organization statement has now been released. I will read the relevant section. Quote, "Preliminary analysis indicates a sustained and geographically widespread increase in atmospheric O2 concentration. The mechanism responsible remains under investigation. The rate of increase, while not yet in the range of acute physiological danger for healthy adults, is inconsistent with any known natural process. Emergency coordination with member states has been initiated." End quote.
Inconsistent with any known natural process. I want to sit with that phrase. That is not bureaucratic hedging. That is a global scientific body saying plainly we have not seen this before. We don't have a category for it. And I think part of what we have to do in this broadcast and in all the hours ahead is to help listeners understand that saying we don't know is not the same as saying there is no hope. It means we are at the edge of what is mapped. What lies beyond any map is uncertain. It is not necessarily catastrophic.
It has now been approximately 11 hours since the initial confirmed readings. I want to give listeners a current snapshot of oxygen levels by region, based on data compiled from monitoring stations in the last 90 minutes. Adelaide, Australia, 27.4% and rising. Nairobi, Kenya, 26.8%. Reykjavik, Iceland, 25.9%. Boulder, Colorado, 26.2%. Tokyo, Japan, 26.1%. London, United Kingdom, 25.7%. Cairo, Egypt, 26.4%. These are now globally consistent readings. There is no longer any ambiguity about whether this is a localized event. This is planetary.
We have received confirmation of a second significant fire incident, this time in Western Australia, near the town of Kalgoorlie. A brush fire ignited in an area that has not been unusually dry. The local fire authority has described the spread as, and I quote, unlike anything we have trained for. Firefighters who have worked in Australia for decades are describing the behavior of the fire as alien. It is moving faster. It is catching on materials that should resist ignition. The town of Kalgoorlie itself has begun voluntary evacuation. About 30,000 people are in the process of leaving. We do not yet know casualties, but we know that some people could not get out in time.
The physics of what is happening in Kalgoorlie and in Sao Paulo, and very likely in a number of other locations we have not yet received reports from, can be described this way. In a normal atmosphere, the energy required to sustain combustion creates a kind of natural speed limit on how fast a fire can grow. Oxygen concentration is the limiting factor. When you remove that limitation, when you provide more oxidizer than the combustion reaction can immediately consume, the fire is no longer constrained by the availability of fuel. It is constrained only by the arrangement of that fuel in space. A field of dry grass that might burn at a walking pace in normal air can burn at a running pace in elevated oxygen. And at the concentrations we are now seeing, approaching 27%, the running becomes a sprint.
I want to read another listener message, this one from a woman in Kalgoorlie. She sent this about 40 minutes ago. Her name is Margaret. She writes, I've lived here for 61 years. My husband and I built our house in 1987. We watched a fire burn 3 miles away this afternoon, and I could feel the heat on my face standing in my front garden. We are driving to Perth now with our dog and our wedding photos. I don't know if we'll have a house to come back to. Please, if you know anything, tell us. Margaret, we are thinking of you. We hope your drive to Perth is safe and swift. And to every listener making a drive like that right now, you are doing the right thing.
It has now been roughly 14 hours. We have our first confirmed casualty figures. Australian Emergency Management has confirmed 3 fatalities in the Kalgoorlie fire zone, 2 of them firefighters. Brazil has confirmed 1 fatality in the Sao Paulo chemical facility fire. Additionally, there are 17 confirmed injuries across both incidents, 4 of them listed as critical. These are the first numbers. I say that not to minimize them. Every single one of those people is irreplaceable. But because our listeners need to understand that we will be tracking these numbers for a long time, and the early hours are always a fraction of what ultimately emerges.
The Indian government has just issued its first national statement on the oxygen increase, and it is notable in tone. I will read the translated excerpt provided to us by our international desk. Quote, The government of India is monitoring atmospheric conditions in coordination with global scientific bodies. Citizens in urban areas are advised to avoid the use of open flames and to restrict the use of gas appliances. Citizens with respiratory conditions should consult their doctors. The government assures the people of India that all necessary measures are being taken, end quote. Measured, careful, not alarmist. But I note, and this is something, they have specifically mentioned urban areas. India has several cities with populations exceeding 10 million people. Telling those people to avoid open flames is a logistical challenge of almost incomprehensible scale.
And here is where we need to begin discussing infrastructure. Because this is not only about fires. It is about the systems that modern civilization depends on, many of which involve controlled combustion, power generation, transportation, industrial processes. The global power grid is predominantly dependent on thermal generation, coal, natural gas, oil. All of those processes involve combustion. In a higher oxygen environment, the operational parameters for thermal power plants shift. Combustion chambers designed for standard oxygen concentrations can run hotter and faster than their safety systems anticipate. We are now getting our first reports of power fluctuations. Spain's national grid operator has reported an unplanned outage affecting portions of Andalusia. The German grid authority has issued a precautionary warning for operators of thermal plants to shift to minimum operating parameters.
Day 2 is beginning. It has been approximately 22 hours since initial readings were confirmed, and I want to describe what the world looks like as best we can piece it together from our network of correspondence and from listener reports. In Sydney, Australia, the sky has turned the color of amber from particulate matter carried on wind from fires burning in New South Wales to the north and west. Schools are closed. The central business district is largely empty. Ferries on the harbor have stopped running because of visibility concerns. The Sydney Opera House sits empty on the harbor. In Sao Paulo, Brazil, a city of 12 million people, emergency services are overwhelmed. The fires have spread from the industrial zone. Residents in the northern suburbs are being told to shelter in place.
Current oxygen readings have now cleared 28% across most monitoring stations, with some equatorial stations reporting as high as 29.1%. To give listeners a frame of reference, throughout most of Earth's history, oxygen has fluctuated. During the Carboniferous period, roughly 300 million years ago, oxygen levels reached approximately 35%. During that period, the fossil record shows insects of enormous size, but also evidence of persistent and widespread wildfires. We are not at 35%. But the direction of travel, if the current rate holds, would put us at 35% within approximately 15 to 18 days. That is the calculation that is now circulating among atmospheric scientists, and it is the calculation that is driving the urgency in government responses we are beginning to see.
The United Nations Secretary General has convened an emergency session of the Security Council. We are told the session is ongoing. The United States has declared a national atmospheric emergency, the first of its kind, and has activated FEMA's emergency coordination protocols. The president of Brazil, speaking to reporters in Brasilia, said, and I translate from Portuguese, "We are facing a challenge that no government in history has ever faced. We ask our citizens to be patient, to be calm, and to help one another." The Chinese government's Xinhua agency has issued a statement saying that all industrial facilities in 12 major provinces have been ordered to halt operations pending safety assessment.
We now have casualty figures that have expanded significantly. Australian Emergency Management now reports 41 confirmed deaths related to fire events in New South Wales, Western Australia, and Queensland. Brazil confirms 19 fatalities. Indonesia has reported its first fire-related casualties. A fire in a dry forest region of Kalimantan has killed at least 23 people. with dozens more missing. In total, we are looking at somewhere north of 80 confirmed deaths globally, with that number almost certainly undercounting actual events because of communication gaps in remote areas. Power outages are beginning to affect our ability to receive reports from certain regions.
I want to talk about hospitals for a moment, because I keep thinking about the people inside them. Every major hospital in the world uses medical gas systems, oxygen lines, anesthetic gas systems, sterilization equipment. Many use electrical systems heavily dependent on backup generators that run on diesel or natural gas. In a world where combustion is becoming unpredictable, where oxygen concentrations are climbing, hospitals are simultaneously the places most likely to be overwhelmed by casualties and the places most at risk from the very conditions causing those casualties. We've received word that 2 hospitals in the greater Sydney area have partially evacuated their non-critical patients as a precautionary measure. A hospital in Lagos, Nigeria, has reportedly lost power after a generator malfunction.
It is now day 3. We have been on air continuously for approximately 60 hours with rotating teams. Oxygen readings globally are now in the range of 30 to 31%. I want to walk through what that means in practical terms. At 30% oxygen, the ignition temperature of wood, dry wood, drops by approximately 15 to 20%. Fabrics, paper, cardboard, materials that require sustained heat to ignite in normal air, can now catch fire from a single spark. Electrical arc events, which are common and normally inconsequential in standard infrastructure, are now capable of starting fires in ways that were not anticipated when that infrastructure was designed. This is not hypothetical. We are now seeing it happen.
The fires in Australia have merged. What began as separate incidents in New South Wales, Queensland, and Western Australia have grown to the point where meteorologists are using the term continental fire complex, a phrase that I don't think any of us fully prepared for. The combined front covers an estimated 300,000 square kilometers. Melbourne, with a population of 5 million people, is under mandatory evacuation order. The evacuation began 14 hours ago. Every road leading south and east is at capacity. Fuel stations are running out of gasoline. We have received reports of violence at service stations, people fighting over fuel. 1 person has reportedly been killed.
The evacuation of Melbourne represents the largest single urban evacuation in Australian history. Emergency planners estimate that a full evacuation of the city's population, given current road conditions and fuel availability, would take approximately 72 hours under normal circumstances. They do not believe they have 72 hours. The government of Victoria has requested military assistance, and the Australian Defence Force has mobilized. Hercules transport aircraft are flying people out of Tullamarine Airport in continuous cycles. The Royal Australian Navy has ships positioned off the coast of Victoria, ready to receive evacuees by sea. This is not a drill. This is the largest logistical military operation Australia has conducted since the Second World War.
I want to read from a message that came to us from a woman named Daniela, who is a nurse in Melbourne. She sent this from her phone during a break in what she described as an impossible shift. She writes, "We have patients who cannot be moved, ventilator dependent, severe trauma. We are not leaving them. The doctors aren't leaving, the nurses aren't leaving. We don't know when or whether help is coming, but we are here. Tell people that. Tell them we are here." Daniela, we hear you. We are telling people.
Alex Mercer. It is now day 4. Total confirmed fatalities from fire events globally stand at 912. That figure comes from governments, not from news organizations, and it includes confirmed deaths only, not missing persons, not unconfirmed reports. Atmospheric scientists have now published a preliminary model of the oxygen trend, and the numbers are stark. The rate of increase appears to have accelerated slightly in the past 24 hours. Current global average is approximately 32.7%. The model projects the global average reaching 40% within 12 to 13 days if the rate holds constant. At 40% oxygen, conditions become, and I want to use precise language here, incompatible with the functioning of most human infrastructure.
The Security Council session at the United Nations produced a joint declaration this morning. I'll read the core of it. Quote, "The member states of the United Nations Security Council call upon all nations to immediately halt all non-essential combustion-based industrial activity. Thermal power generation, non-essential vehicle traffic, and open burning of any kind are to be suspended pending further assessment. Member states are called upon to share scientific data openly and immediately with the World Meteorological Organization and affiliated bodies. A global scientific task force is hereby established to determine the origin and trajectory of the atmospheric anomaly." End quote. This is the first time the Security Council has issued a unanimous environmental directive of this scope.
There is a practical problem with that directive, which I want to address directly. You cannot simply turn off thermal power generation for most of the world's population without cascading consequences. The grid doesn't work that way. The infrastructure doesn't work that way. In many countries, thermal generation represents 80 to 90% of electricity production. Switching it off means cutting power to billions of people. And many of those people depend on power for refrigeration of food and medicine, for water pumping systems, for hospitals, for communication. The cure in this case has enormous costs, and yet the alternative, continuing to run plants that may fail catastrophically as oxygen levels rise, has costs that are potentially higher.
India made the decision this morning to implement rolling power cuts across all 28 states. The cuts began at 6 in the morning local time. Within 4 hours, the communications breakdown in rural areas had begun. We have lost contact with our correspondents in Bihar and Uttar Pradesh. We do not know what is happening in those regions. We have received a message from a listener in New Delhi. Her name is Priya, who writes, "The city is very quiet. The traffic, the horns, the generators, all of it is gone. It is strangely peaceful and strangely terrifying at the same time. I have never heard Delhi this quiet in my entire life."
It is day 5. We are getting the first reports of what is being called oxygen toxicity fatalities. Deaths caused not by fire, but by the direct physiological effects of breathing air with oxygen concentrations above what the human body can safely manage for extended periods. At 32 to 33% oxygen, prolonged exposure, meaning hours and days, not minutes, begins to cause pulmonary oxygen toxicity. Symptoms include coughing, chest pain, difficulty breathing, and in severe cases, lung damage. People who are very young, elderly, or have pre-existing respiratory conditions are most vulnerable. The WHO has now issued a global health advisory.
The WHO advisory is significant because it moves us from fires and infrastructure, which were the primary concerns, to the direct human health question. We are now in territory where the air itself is becoming a medical concern. The advisory recommends that people in regions with the highest oxygen concentrations, currently identified as equatorial and subtropical zones, should minimize physical exertion, which increases oxygen consumption rate. It recommends that people with respiratory conditions use filtered masks. It notes that children and the elderly are at elevated risk and should be kept calm and cool, as higher body temperature accelerates the effects of hyperoxia.
Day 6. Oxygen levels have now crossed 34% globally. Australia's situation has become, and I have to use a word that I do not use lightly, catastrophic. The continental fire complex now covers more than 1 million square kilometers. roughly the combined area of France and Germany. The smoke plume is visible from space. The government of Australia has effectively ceased to manage the fires in the sense of trying to stop them, and has shifted entirely to managing the human consequences of them. The fires are no longer controllable. Nothing in human capability can control a fire of this size in this atmosphere.
I want to be honest about what is happening in Australia. This is a country of 26 million people, and as of this morning, approximately 9 million of them are in the process of evacuation, sheltering in coastal cities, or have already left the country entirely. The airports of Sydney and Brisbane are overwhelmed. Hundreds of international flights have been diverted or canceled due to visibility conditions and aviation fuel concerns. Jet fuel combustion under elevated oxygen conditions presents challenges for aircraft engine management. The port of Sydney has been converted into an emergency humanitarian terminal. Australian Navy and international vessels are conducting what emergency managers are now calling the Southern Exodus.
I have just received a confirmed total from Australian Emergency Management. Total fatalities in Australia from fire events, heat, and oxygen toxicity as of the most recent count, 4,811. I'll say that again. 4,811 people dead in Australia in the last 6 days. This is now the deadliest natural disaster in Australian history, and it is not over. It may, in fact, be far from over.
The Amazonas region of Brazil is now reporting fires that have crossed from the existing deforestation zone into intact primary rainforest. The Amazon is not supposed to burn like this. The moisture content of primary rainforest normally makes it resistant to fire ignition. In this atmosphere, that resistance has been compromised. We are watching the Amazon burn. I do not have words for what that means ecologically, beyond saying that the Amazon generates a significant fraction of the world's oxygen through photosynthesis. And if we destroy the world's largest oxygen generator in an oxygen crisis, the terrible irony of that will be studied, if anyone is left to study it.
Day 7. It has been 1 week. The global oxygen average is now 35.4%. Death toll globally, 22,000 confirmed. This figure is almost certainly a significant undercount, as communication blackouts in affected regions mean that vast numbers of casualties are not being reported. Countries with the highest confirmed casualties at this point, Australia, Brazil, Indonesia, and across sub-Saharan Africa, where multiple simultaneous fire events combined with extremely limited evacuation infrastructure have created a situation that emergency responders are describing as beyond anything for which international aid frameworks were designed.
We have a message from an aid worker in Kinshasa, Democratic Republic of Congo. He asks us not to use his name. He writes, "The international community's attention is on Australia and Brazil. I understand that. But here, 3 countries' worth of people are burning, and no one is coming. I am watching things I will carry for the rest of my life. Please say Congo. Please say Kinshasa. Please say that we are here." We say it. Kinshasa, Congo, you are here. We see you.
Day 8. We are getting the first scientific papers, preliminary, unreviewed, but being shared openly under the emergency scientific sharing protocols established by the UN task force that attempt to explain the cause of the oxygen increase. The leading hypothesis, and I want to emphasize this is still hypothesis, is a phenomenon being described as a synchronized global photosynthetic surge. The mechanism appears to involve an unprecedented and simultaneous bloom of photosynthetic microorganisms, primarily marine phytoplankton, across the world's major ocean basins. This bloom is producing oxygen at a rate that vastly exceeds the ocean's normal carbon absorption capacity, and the excess is entering the atmosphere.
And I want to make sure our listeners understand why this is happening now, if that is indeed what's happening. The scientists publishing these preliminary findings are pointing to a confluence of ocean temperature anomalies, warmer surface water across multiple ocean basins simultaneously, combined with unusual concentrations of trace minerals brought up by deep-water upwelling events triggered by a series of underwater seismic events over the past year. The ocean essentially became a perfect breeding medium for phytoplankton at enormous scale. And phytoplankton do what phytoplankton do. They photosynthesize. They convert carbon dioxide and sunlight into oxygen. And they have been doing it, billions and billions of them, for weeks before anyone noticed the signal.
We are at day 9. The oxygen level has reached 37%. The city of Jakarta, Indonesia, population 34 million in the greater metropolitan area, is under evacuation order. Jakarta is already among the world's most densely populated urban environments, and the logistics of moving 34 million people are essentially impossible in the time frame available. What is happening instead is a partial evacuation of those who can get out, and a shelter-in-place order for those who cannot. The Indonesian military has established fire perimeters around the city's most critical zones. Hospitals are being emptied of patients who can be moved. The patients who cannot be moved remain.
The smell, I'm told by a correspondent on the ground in Jakarta before we lost contact, is unlike anything. Burning vegetation, burning plastic, burning rubber, and beneath all of that, the distinctive smell of extremely oxygenated air, which some people have described as sharp and metallic and almost pleasant, which is itself an unsettling feature of this crisis. The air that is killing us smells, at first breath, like vigor, like vitality. This is the cruelty of it.
Day 10. We have lost reliable communication with large parts of Indonesia, sub-Saharan Africa, and interior Brazil. Power grids in these regions have failed in ways that are proving impossible to repair under current conditions. The global confirmed death toll has crossed 100,000. 100,000 in 10 days. Most deaths are from fire events. A growing number are from oxygen toxicity. A smaller but increasing number are from what responders are calling secondary effects: vehicle accidents in smoke conditions, drowning during sea evacuations, violence during resource competition.
The refugee situation on a global scale has now become the largest displacement event in human history. Estimates from UNHCR suggest that as many as 400 million people have been displaced from their homes. Most are moving toward coastlines. Many are moving toward higher latitudes, toward cooler and in some cases slightly lower oxygen environments. There's a mass movement of humanity toward Antarctica's nearest accessible latitudes. New Zealand has declared itself a humanitarian state and is accepting refugees without restriction. The New Zealand government's statement was brief and extraordinary. It said simply, "Every person who can reach us will be cared for." Ships are making the crossing across the Tasman Sea in continuous rotation.
It is day 11. The oxygen level has reached 38.9%. We are receiving the first reports of spontaneous ignition events in urban areas. Fire starting without any identifiable ignition source. Electrical infrastructure is failing in ways consistent with arc events igniting surrounding materials in the elevated oxygen environment. In Paris, France, a fire that began somewhere in the electrical system of the 19th arrondissement spread to 5 city blocks within 40 minutes. The Paris Fire Brigade described the fire as growing faster than they could estimate. The Eiffel Tower, which is steel, does not burn, but the neighborhoods around it do. The French government has ordered the evacuation of central Paris.
The evacuation of Paris. I keep hearing the words, and they feel like they belong to a novel, not to a news broadcast. Approximately 2 million people live in the city proper. The trains are running on reduced capacity. The RER lines are overwhelmed. People are walking. Many people are walking out of Paris on foot along the banks of the Seine. A listener who sent a message before we lost contact with her said she was walking with her 3-year-old daughter on her back and her elderly father holding her hand. She said, "Mom, everyone is walking together and no one is being unkind. That is the thing I want you to know. On the road out of Paris, people are being kind to each other."
Day 12. Oxygen, 39.6%. This is the number that atmospheric scientists identified prior to this event as the theoretical threshold above which sustained, widespread, irreversible fire events in terrestrial ecosystems become essentially inevitable. We have reached it. The fires now burning across the major land masses of the world are collectively the largest combustion event in recorded history. The smoke layer in the upper atmosphere has become thick enough to noticeably reduce solar radiation reaching the surface. There is a grim irony here as well. The smoke is slowing photosynthesis. The very fires created by the oxygen surge are reducing the sunlight available to the phytoplankton that are producing the oxygen. A feedback mechanism is potentially emerging.
Scientists are describing this feedback loop with carefully hedged optimism. The smoke layer is growing. Less sunlight means less photosynthetic activity. Less photosynthetic activity means slower oxygen production. If the bloom can be starved of sunlight by the smoke created by its own excess, the system might begin to correct itself. This is the closest thing to hope that I have been able to report in days, and I want to be honest about how fragile it is. It is a hypothesis based on incomplete data in the middle of the most chaotic atmospheric event in human history. But it is there.
We are now at day 13. The global oxygen average has, for the first time, shown a slight reduction in its rate of increase. This is not a decrease in oxygen level. Levels remain at approximately 39.8%. But the rate of increase has slowed. Whether this represents the beginning of the feedback correction, or simply a fluctuation in the data, cannot yet be determined. What is not ambiguous is the current state of the world. Indonesia has lost the islands of Sumatra and Kalimantan to fire in a functional sense, meaning fire coverage is now so extensive across those landmasses that human habitation has ceased across most of their area. The populations of those islands, approximately 60 million people combined, have been evacuated or displaced in what has been described as a survival migration.
Day 13. And I want to stop here and account for something that is easy to lose when you are dealing in numbers the size of millions and tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands. The people. Not statistics. People. A woman named Fatima, who was a school teacher in Pekanbaru on the island of Sumatra, sent a message to a relative in Singapore, who forwarded it to us before communications were lost. Fatima wrote, "I taught my class our last lesson this morning. I don't know if any of them will ever sit in a classroom again. I told them what I always told them, that they were capable of extraordinary things, then I helped them board the boat." That was the last message from that phone. Fatima, we say your name.
Day 14. 2 weeks. The oxygen level has plateaued. 39.8 to 39.9%, holding for the past 36 hours. The smoke layer, combined with a natural die-off of the phytoplankton bloom, which has consumed available nutrients in the surface ocean at a rate that cannot be sustained, appears to be triggering the self-correction that scientists hypothesized. The bloom is collapsing from the top. Oxygen production is declining. The atmosphere is beginning, in the most tentative and preliminary sense, to stabilize, but stabilize at 39.9%, which is still a world transformed.
Let me describe the world at day 14 as clearly as I can. Australia, as a functioning state, has effectively ceased to exist in its pre-crisis form. The fire complex has consumed roughly 70% of the continent's land area. What remains habitable is concentrated in coastal strips, particularly in the south and east, and even those areas are under severe environmental stress. The government of Australia is operating from a naval vessel in Sydney Harbour. New Zealand is hosting more than 3 million Australian refugees. The Pacific Islands region is coordinating a sustained maritime rescue operation. Those are not words I ever expected to say.
The Amazon basin. 60% destroyed. The primary rainforest, the lung of the planet, as it has often been called, which is a metaphor that this crisis has made painfully literal, has been burned over an area nearly the size of Western Europe. Brazil's interior is ash. The coastal cities, Rio de Janeiro, Fortaleza, Belém, are still partially standing, and millions of Brazilians have crowded into them and onto ships, leaving them. The Brazilian government is coordinating with Portugal, Spain, and Cape Verde on a permanent refugee resettlement program. Brazil, as a geographic entity, still exists. As the country it was 2 weeks ago, it does not.
Indonesia, 23,000 islands. Many of the smaller ones have burned entirely. The larger islands, Java, which was home to more than 150 million people, have seen mass coastal concentration of their populations. Java's northern coastal cities are overwhelmed. The logistics of feeding, watering, and providing shelter for millions of people in a strip of coastline while the interior of the island burns behind them is a challenge that has no precedent in human history.
Day 15. For the first time, a sustained downward measurement. Oxygen has dropped fractionally to 39.6%. This is almost certainly within the margin of measurement error, but the trend, no increase, and now possibly a small decrease, is being cited by atmospheric scientists as the first genuine evidence that the phytoplankton bloom is in terminal decline. The cause of the bloom's collapse is as follows. Phytoplankton require specific trace nutrients in surface ocean water. The bloom consumed those nutrients at an extraordinary rate. The surface ocean is now substantially depleted of the iron, phosphorus, and nitrogen compounds that support photosynthetic microorganism growth. Without those nutrients, the bloom cannot sustain itself. It is dying. It will take time, weeks to months, for ocean circulation to restore nutrient concentrations. During that recovery period, oxygen production from the ocean's surface layer will be dramatically below normal.
Day 16. I want to tell you about the places that held, because in all of this, in all the loss and fire and displacement, there are cities that did not burn, that held together. Reykjavik, Iceland, which was one of the first stations to detect the anomaly, is intact. Iceland's volcanic, treeless landscape gave fires little to consume. The city is now housing nearly 200,000 refugees, an extraordinary number for a city of 200,000 residents. The Icelanders, by every account we have received, opened their homes, not their shelters, their homes. Wellington, New Zealand is functioning. Cape Town, South Africa is battered but standing. Lisbon, Portugal, which suffered fires in its surrounding forests, has been holding. The city itself stands.
Day 17. Oxygen is at 39.1%. The decline, while slow, is now statistically confirmed. The bloom is collapsing. The fires, paradoxically, are beginning to consume themselves. Not because the atmosphere has returned to normal, but because the fuel supply in the most devastated regions has been exhausted. Fire requires fuel as well as oxygen. In much of Australia and the Amazon, there is nothing left to burn. The fires are self-extinguishing at their perimeters by running out of material. The satellite imagery, which has been distributed by NASA and the European Space Agency to every news organization on Earth, shows a blackened continent surrounded by smoke, and in places where the smoke is thinnest, the faint glow of something that might be ocean.
Day 18. The confirmed global death toll has now reached 900,000. We say that number, and I'm aware that we have been saying numbers for 18 days, and each one has been larger than the last. And I am aware of something that I think every journalist and broadcaster in this industry is grappling with. The danger that the size of a number becomes a shield against feeling its weight. 900,000 people, each of them with someone's reason to wake up in the morning. I don't know how to make that real, except to say that we keep saying the names when we have them, and when we don't, we hold the space for them anyway.
Day 19. Oxygen at 38.5%. The trend is confirmed. The UN Scientific Task Force has issued its first formal report on the cause and trajectory of the event, and it has been distributed globally. I want to read the conclusion section, which is brief. Quote, "The atmospheric oxygen increase of 2025 was caused by an unprecedented synchronized bloom of marine phytoplankton, principally of the classes Prochlorococcus and Emiliania huxleyi, driven by anomalous ocean surface temperatures and accelerated by seismic-driven deep-water upwelling events that provided extraordinary concentrations of trace nutrients to surface waters across multiple ocean basins simultaneously. The probability of such a confluence of conditions occurring again within any human timescale is estimated to be vanishingly small. Atmospheric oxygen is expected to return to near baseline levels within 8 to 14 months, as the bloom's trace nutrient depletion is remediated by normal ocean circulation patterns." End quote.
8 to 14 months. That is the sentence that I want people to hold. 8 to 14 months to return to near baseline. We are 19 days in. The world is fundamentally altered, but the air will heal itself. That is the extraordinary news embedded in an extraordinary report. The air will heal itself because the ocean will heal itself, because the thing that caused this was a living organism following its nature, and when living organisms consume their resources, they decline. The ocean's bloom is declining. The air is already, barely but measurably, improving.
Day 21. 3 weeks. Oxygen is at 37.8%. This is still, as I have said throughout, a profoundly elevated level. Fires continue in regions where fuel remains. Parts of Central Africa, northern South America, and southern Asia are still experiencing active fire events. But the global spread of fire has stabilized, and in many regions is now contracting. Emergency responders are beginning to move from evacuation operations to humanitarian operations, establishing food and water distribution, medical care, and shelter in the regions where people have gathered.
The world's ports are some of the most extraordinary human scenes right now. Every port city that is still functioning has become a hub of extraordinary, frantic, exhausted human activity. The port of Mumbai, the port of Cape Town, the port of Lisbon, the port of Buenos Aires, all of them are receiving ships carrying refugees from burned regions and sending ships back out for more. The international maritime community, cargo companies, naval fleets, coast guards, fishing boats, private vessels, has organized itself under the framework of the UN Emergency Maritime Coordination into what amounts to the largest sea-based humanitarian operation in history.
Day 23. The global oxygen average is 37.1%. Casualty figures have now been subjected to an initial reconciliation process by the International Emergency Database, and I have to give our listeners the most accurate number we have at this point. Total confirmed deaths directly attributable to the oxygen event: 1.4 million. That figure includes fire deaths, oxygen toxicity fatalities, and documented secondary deaths. However, the task force's preliminary mortality modeling, which accounts for regions where communication and data collection have been severely disrupted, places the estimated total mortality, including unconfirmed and modeled deaths, at somewhere between 4 and 6 million. The range reflects the depth of the data gap in Central Africa interior Indonesia, and parts of South America.
4 to 6 million. We will not know the precise number, perhaps ever. The regions where we are least certain are also the regions where the infrastructure of record-keeping, birth registries, hospital records, census databases, has been most severely damaged or destroyed. There are communities that are simply gone, and the only evidence they existed is in the memories of survivors who may be scattered across 3 continents. The UN has established an Office of Missing Persons that is already receiving millions of inquiries.
Day 25. The situation in Australia, which has been among the most severe, has crossed a threshold that government officials are now articulating publicly. The Prime Minister of Australia, speaking from the naval vessel that has served as the seat of government, gave a statement this morning that I want to read in full. Quote, "The land we have lived on for tens of thousands of years, Indigenous Australians for 60,000 years, and millions of others for 2 centuries, has been altered in ways that will take generations to understand. A significant portion of our continent is not, at this moment, habitable by human beings or by the species of the ecosystems that once thrived there. The government of Australia does not cease to exist. The people of Australia do not cease to exist. We are alive. We are caring for each other. We will rebuild on the land that remains, and we will do so with gratitude to every nation that has offered its harbor, its homes, and its hands." End quote.
There is something about that statement that I think I will carry for the rest of my life. We are alive. 2 words that contain an entire civilizational resilience. We are alive. Australia is diminished. Parts of it may not be habitable for decades as vegetation regrows, as soil restabilizes, as watersheds reconstitute. But the people are alive. Millions of them. In New Zealand, in the Pacific Islands, in the remaining coastal zones of Australia itself. Alive.
Day 27. Oxygen is at 36.3%. The decline has been steady and consistent for the past 12 days. It will be months before we return to anything approaching 21%. But the model projection has become more confident, not less, with each day's data. The phytoplankton bloom is effectively over. The ocean surface in the areas of the original bloom, the South Pacific, the Southern Indian Ocean, the Mid-Atlantic, is showing dramatically reduced photosynthetic activity on satellite spectroscopy. The oxygen factory has shut down.
I want to take a moment to talk about what human beings did during these 27 days. Because this story is not only the story of what was destroyed, it is also the story of what people did for each other when the sky turned hostile. The Icelanders who opened their homes, the New Zealanders who took in millions, the maritime workers who did not stop sailing, the nurses in Melbourne who stayed, the firefighters who died in Kalgoorlie, the school teacher in Pekanbaru who taught one last lesson and helped her students board a boat, the ordinary drivers on roads out of burning cities who somehow, remarkably, with the exception of terrifying moments, mostly kept letting each other through.
Day 28. This is nearing the end of our first month of coverage. I want to give a full accounting of what we know and what remains uncertain. Oxygen level, 36.0%, and continuing to decline at approximately 0.1 to 0.15% per day. Projected return to 23 to 24%, which is the level at which most fire risk normalizes and oxygen toxicity risk drops significantly, approximately 4 to 5 months. Return to baseline 21%, 8 to 12 months.
Countries lost or partially lost in functional terms. And I say this as an assessment of current habitability and not as a judgment on the permanence of peoples or nations. Australia has lost approximately 70% of its interior and southern inland regions to fire damage. These areas will not be habitable for years, possibly decades, in the worst affected zones. Indonesia has lost habitable access to most of Kalimantan and roughly 60% of Sumatra. These are geological territories with indigenous cultures, languages, ecosystems, and communities that are now displaced and in many cases destroyed. The Amazon region of Brazil, comprising parts of Amazonas, Pará, and Acre states, has been burned at a scale that fundamentally alters the regional ecosystem. The Congo Basin has suffered comparable losses. Together, these regions represent the majority of the Earth's primary tropical rainforest. That is a wound with a geological recovery timeline.
What remains? Let me be specific about what remains, because it matters. Europe, with significant fire damage to southern and Mediterranean regions, retains its infrastructure in the north and northwest. Scandinavia is largely intact. The British Isles suffered fire damage to heathlands and forests, but major urban centers, with the exception of parts of London and Birmingham that required partial evacuation, are standing. North America. The United States lost significant areas of California, Texas, and the Southeast to fire events, but the major population centers, New York, Chicago, Boston, the Pacific Northwest, are standing and functioning at reduced capacity. Canada, with its vast water resources and less fire-vulnerable boreal forest zones in the far north, has fared better than most and has been among the world's largest recipients of refugees.
South Asia, India's major coastal cities, Mumbai, Chennai, Kolkata, are standing, severely stressed but standing. Delhi suffered significant air quality and fire damage but was not consumed. China's coastal industrial zones are damaged but retained. The interior suffered severe fire damage. The Middle East and North Africa, regions that were already arid, saw fire events primarily in vegetation corridors, but major cities are largely intact. Sub-Saharan Africa has suffered disproportionate loss relative to global attention, and that is a failure of coverage and global priority that this broadcast acknowledges directly and with regret.
Day 29. The UN Scientific Task Force has now released an updated mortality model with narrowed confidence intervals. Their current estimate for total global deaths attributable to the oxygen event is 5.2 million, with a confidence range of 4.8 to 5.7 million. I will read that once more, slowly. 5.2 million human beings, dead in 29 days from an atmospheric event caused by an unprecedented bloom of microscopic ocean organisms that were simply doing what they have always done, converting sunlight to oxygen, but doing it at a scale and in a synchronization that no model had predicted and that no government or scientific institution had planned for.
And I think about what Rajan, the listener who called in on the first night, was asking about his mother on supplemental oxygen therapy. I think about Margaret from Kalgoorlie, driving to Perth with her dog and her wedding photos. I think about Daniela, the nurse in Melbourne who said, "We are here." I think about Fatima, who taught her last lesson and helped her students board a boat, and from whom we never heard again. I think about the unnamed aid worker in Kinshasa who said, "Please say Congo." I think about the woman walking out of Paris with her daughter on her back and her father holding her hand, who said that people were being kind. I am holding all of them. All of them.
Day 30. 1 month. Oxygen is at 35.6% and continues its consistent decline. The World Meteorological Organization has issued a formal statement moving the status of the atmospheric event from active emergency to recovery, monitoring. This is a technical designation, not a declaration that the crisis is over. It is an acknowledgement that the upward trajectory has ended, that the causative event, the phytoplankton bloom, is no longer active, and that the atmospheric system is now in a recovery phase that will be long, slow, and carefully watched, but that is moving in the right direction.
What comes now is not easy. It is in some ways the harder part. The fires are out or diminishing. The air is improving slowly. But the 5 million people who died, they are still dead. The forests that burned, they do not come back in months, but in decades. The communities that were displaced, the cultures that were scattered, the languages spoken by people in forests that no longer exist, some of those will not be recovered. The ecosystems of the Amazon and the Congo and the Indonesian archipelago, which sustained more biodiversity than any other places on Earth, have been damaged in ways that ecologists are only beginning to calculate. The Earth will heal, but it will heal into a different shape than it had before.
The international community is now organizing what is being called the Global Restoration Compact, a framework for the redistribution of populations, the rebuilding of infrastructure, the environmental recovery of devastated regions, and the long-term support of nations whose territories have been most severely affected. Australia, Brazil, Indonesia, and the Democratic Republic of Congo have all been named as primary beneficiaries. The Compact's financial commitments, pledged so far by 47 nations, total more than $12 trillion over 20 years. It is an unprecedented commitment, and it will almost certainly not be enough, and it will almost certainly be fought over politically for years. But it is there. It is a beginning.
I want to end our 1-month coverage mark not with a statistic, but with something simpler. There are right now hundreds of millions of people in temporary housing, in schools and stadiums and ships at anchor, in the homes of strangers who became neighbors overnight. There are children who have never seen their home burned asleep in unfamiliar beds, and parents watching them sleep and thinking tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow. There are scientists in laboratories in Geneva and Tokyo and Nairobi and Sao Paulo and Auckland measuring the oxygen level every hour, watching the decimal move in the right direction. There are engineers in every country on Earth trying to figure out how to rebuild power grids that are safer and cleaner and less dependent on the combustion that became so dangerous in those 39% days.
And somewhere in the ocean, in the South Pacific and the Southern Indian Ocean and the Mid-Atlantic, the phytoplankton are dying in their trillions, as all living things do when their resources are exhausted. They had no malice. They had no awareness of what they did. They were alive, and they followed their nature. And their nature at unprecedented scale became something that changed the world. The cause of this event was life itself, exuberant, uncontrolled, extraordinary life, doing what life has always done, converting sunlight into breath, and doing it beyond any scale that human civilization had anticipated or prepared for.
5.2 million dead, portions of 4 continents functionally uninhabitable, the largest displacement of human beings in recorded history. And yet, this matters, and I believe it is my job to say it. And yet most of us are still here. 7.5 billion people are still breathing air that is day by day returning to something closer to what it was. The world that those 7.5 billion people will build will be different. It will have to be. Different in how it monitors the natural world. Different in how it shares information and coordinates responses. Different in what it values and what it protects. Different if we are serious in how it treats the tropical ecosystems whose loss we are now quantifying in catastrophe. Different if we are honest in who gets help and who gets left behind, because the world that burned disproportionately was also the world that had been disproportionately overlooked.
We will continue our coverage. The recovery phase is not a story that ends. It is the story that continues. We will be here, tracking oxygen levels, tracking casualty reconciliation, tracking the refugee resettlements, the rebuilding efforts, the political consequences, the ecological recovery, the science of what happened and what it means for the future. This is Lost Signal Radio, And as long as there is a signal and a world to broadcast to, we will be here.
We want to close this hour with the message that came to us this morning from a listener in Reykjavik, Iceland. Her name is Sigridor. She writes, "Outside my window right now there is fog over the harbor. It is ordinary fog. Not smoke, not ash. Just the fog that comes in September from the sea. I have lived here my whole life, and I have never been grateful for fog before. But this morning I stood at my window and I cried because it was just ordinary fog, and ordinary things are the most extraordinary things I know right now. Take care of each other. The oxygen is coming back. Please take care of each other."
Sigridur, thank you. To every listener who has been with us through this month, driving evacuation roads, sheltering in coastal cities, sitting in strange houses in countries you did not know, working in hospitals, sailing ships, answering phones, administering aid, measuring the air, teaching children who needed to understand what was happening to their world. We have been here with you. We remain here. The oxygen level today is 35.6% and falling. The cause was a global phytoplankton bloom, now in collapse. 5.2 million people are gone, and we are alive. We are still here. You are listening to Lost Signal Radio. We will be back after a brief pause in coverage.
Stay with us.